Hi, I'm Beth.
And I'm Marty. 45 years ago today, the National Air and Space Museum opened. Then President Gerald Ford was there, and a ribbon cutting was done by a robotic arm activated with a signal sent from the Viking 1 spacecraft.
The museum's first director was there as well, Apollo 11 astronaut Michael Collins. He's the one looking at his watch, anxiously waiting for that signal from Mars. We worked with him a few years ago and got a chance to talk with him about leading the museum and its legacy.
My coming in to being an astronaut was sort of a stair-step program. I had an opportunity to go to West Point, which was a free education, and that was a very important consideration. And then when I graduated, I drifted over into the Air Force, became a pilot. One thing led to another. I was a test pilot at Edwards, and that at that time was a good entry point to the astronaut program. You know, you bring to a flight 30 years of living on this dinky little planet, and whatever you've been able to put together and try to retain, all that I think goes into the preparation for a flight.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
When Neil Armstrong stepped out onto the surface of the moon, that I think was kind of the peak of the interest that the American public had. Buildings like this do a lot to sustain that level of interest, and that's one of the things that I think is very important about this beautiful surrounding, the National Air and Space Museum, which is a vital part of the Smithsonian institution.
The exploration of space will go ahead.
One of the really nice things about Apollo was its objective was very clear. President Kennedy had said, put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. I came to Washington sneaking up on 1976, and I used to run around town saying, museum on the mall by the bicentennial. And I'll take those three important facets of Apollo and try to transfer them to the construction of this building. And it worked out well. We were supposed to open July 4th, 1976, and we actually beat it by 3 days, July 1st, 1976. My name is Mike Collins, retired for many years now, but back in '76 I was the director of this magnificent Air and Space Museum.
We are now joined by three people who have been at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum since it opened. We've got Curator Emeritus Dr. Tom Crouch, Program Manager for the Center for Earth and Planetary Studies, Priscilla Strain, and Curator in the Aeronautics Department, Dr. Bob Vanderlinden. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
I'm going to kick off today's panel by asking you all, what was Michael Collins like as a boss?
He was just this incredible figure, like just would pass in the hallway, and every time he went by, my jaw would drop. I go, oh my God, that's Michael Collins, Apollo 11 astronaut.
Mike was such a personable guy, and he had such a great sense of humor. He really did. He was a people person. I mean, he really took an interest in the staff. He knew everybody, knew what they were doing, just was a great guy to work for. He really was.
I always remember the day that the museum building opened, and the staff, we all headed for the elevator to go back to the third floor, to go back to our offices after the ceremony. And Mike was there. And of course, since President Ford was there, there were lots of Secret Service people all around. And the elevator door opened, and the Secret Service man pushed Mike into the elevator and commanded the elevator operator to whisk him by himself to the third floor. And so we all just waited for the elevator to come back. And when it did, and we eventually got to the third floor, there was Mike standing by the elevator waiting for us, apologizing that that had happened, that, you know, that just so wasn't his style. You know, he was just always so friendly and thoughtful.
That's amazing. Well, we'd like to know a little bit about how each of you ended up at Air and Space. Tom, how did you end up at Air and Space?
When Neil Armstrong was on his way to the moon, the governor of Ohio decided that the state was going to build a museum for Neil Armstrong in his hometown, Wapakoneta. And here's this 22, 23-year-old kid, the only one who knew an elevator from an aileron. And so that was my first museum. I got tapped to do the exhibits at the Neil Armstrong Museum. I made a whole string of trips to Washington to meet with Paul Garber and Lou Casey, and Mike was not there yet, but I got to know the staff of the Air and Space Museum that way. And a few years later, 1974, Mike just picked up the phone and said, you know, there are a lot of guys here who know you and worked with you when you built that museum. And Neil says you're okay. And would you like to stop doing Ohio history and help come to build the new Air and Space Museum?
Tom, that may be one of my favorite lines ever. Neil says I'm okay.
Chris, I understand you have a pretty interesting story about how you ended up at the National Air and Space Museum. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
At the time, the director of the Center for Earth and Planetary Studies, Farouk Elbaz, had NASA grants that funded research assistant positions to study the lunar photography from Apollo, and also to work on the Apollo-Soyuz test project. And at the time, I was a geology major at Smith College in Massachusetts, and turned out Farouk's wife had gone to Smith as well. So Farouk's wife said, well, you know, you're looking for research assistants, you should look at Smith. And he said, well, yeah, okay. And she said, tomorrow. So he contacted the geology department at Smith, and actually ended up hiring 3 of us to work on the NASA grants.
Do you want to tell us who Farouk Elbaz was, Chris?
That's what I was going to say. Of all the colorful characters, and there were a lot of them at that museum in the beginning, Farouk Elbaz was one of the most delightful and certainly one of the most colorful. What a great guy.
Farouk had worked extensively on the Apollo program. He worked on landing site selection. He trained the astronauts for orbital observations of the moon, and trained them in geology and what geological observations they should make.
That's awesome. Bob, how did you end up at the museum?
I was born in DC, about 2 miles from the museum, grew up in the Bethesda suburbs, and I spent a lot of time in the old Air and Space Museum as a kid, and all over the Smithsonian, you might imagine. But I remember the old building, and I'd just go down like once a month, especially during the summer, every couple of weeks, hoping they changed something. They never much did. I was in college at the time, out in Colorado, nowhere near here. But I just kind of hinted to all people, to my mother, said, God, I really don't want to be a lawyer. I have a history degree, but there's got to be something else. But I'd really like at least to volunteer at the Air and Space Museum. My mother knew this lovely lady at our church. Not that I went to church very often, but my mom did. And she was Mariva Belden. I think Tom probably remembers her.
You bet.
She was the registrar.
Yep.
And she got me the name of the person to write to. Ironically, it was Walt Boyne, to volunteer. And he said, come on in. And I sat down with Walt. Now, Walt was a colonel, ex-colonel, Air Force. I was a long-haired hippie commie. I had hair down here and a nice thick beard. And he was very nice and all that. And I suspect, on looking back, he was trying to get rid of me. But he decided he was going to assign me to Glenn Sweeting, who you all also remember, who was our curator for flight material, a former Air Force Master Sergeant, as straight-laced and conservative as humanly possible. And I think he figured that'd be it. I'd be gone in 5 minutes. Well, for whatever reason, Glenn and I hit it off, and I'm still here. So,
Tom, do you want to tell us a little bit about what the days like were before the museum opened?
It was hectic. It was an interesting time. We were all curators were working on exhibitions. I mean, we had 20 some odd galleries to fill really in about a year. And so I was working, for example, on 2.5 galleries, and a lot of the other folks were the same way. So multitasking and just incredibly busy. One of the interesting things about that last year, 1975, 1976, not only were we doing the exhibition program during that period, but 3 of us actually wrote our doctoral dissertations or finished them and graduated with our PhDs just before the museum opened.
Bob, what are your memories of the grand opening?
it's a beautiful day. I remember the Thunderbirds flying over. You know, the president, the vice president, Chief Justice Berger was there. You know, quite the celebration. And there was a select group of Smithsonian people. They're sitting up on the top of the area where the ceremony was. Everybody else was several steps down at street level. And there was room for some staff members, and there was a lottery for it. And I got one of the seats. And so I'm up there and watching it. So I had a great view of it. I just remember Kitty Scott, the librarian at the time, was not happy that this volunteer got a seat, and she did not. You know? I do remember the Viking did come out and snip the ribbon, although had some signal problems. It took a while for it to get there. A little bit embarrassing, but it was great. It was one big party, big celebration. Everybody was so happy. I do have to remember, you know, as Tom was saying, and I know Chris experienced it too, the feeling of the staff leading up to the opening was really, it was wonderful. Everybody was really enthusiastic. Nobody refused to do a job. You know, there's a legend that Mike Collins was out there with a paintbrush at one point, which is true. Everyone was pitching in. It was a lot like they said with the Apollo program. You ask the guy taking out the trash, "What are you doing?" "I'm putting the man on the moon," because everybody was working together, and it was a wonderful feeling. You know, in '75, when they moved in, the offices were ready, the lights were on, but the air conditioning was not.
Right.
And the building has like 3 windows that open, and no ventilation. And that whole summer, while Tom and Chris was working hard, and I'm sitting there doing all this work for Glenn with the uniforms and getting ready, we were perspiring very heavily because it was a very, very hot summer. And those of you might remember,
fire alarm went off every day.
Oh, it was awful
In the beginning.
You know,
Yep.
They set up these big fans that supposedly moved the air, but it didn't.
What I remember is when the doors opened and those people poured in. We had been working on this building for, 3 years at that point. 1 year in the building, actually building it. And I mean, the excitement getting ready to open and the hectic stuff and so on. And I guess we all knew that it would be a success. We were pretty sure of that, but I don't think anybody expected what actually did happen. And it happened that first day. Those people pouring in that door, it was just incredible. And of course,
it didn't stop.
It didn't stop.
You know, it wasn't just the initial surge of people. That surge came in, and it kept coming in and coming in and coming in. It was wonderful, but it overwhelmed the place.
We had 1 million visitors, I think, in less than a month,
right?
And 5 million in 6 months.
Our building was designed for what, 3 to 4 million a year. We exceeded that. Yeah, she says with a couple of months. The public cafeteria was not the nicest place to have lunch. It was, it was built for the 3 million a year, and it was just overwhelmed. You know.
We'd like to know, do you all have a favorite memory from the museum? Maybe it's an artifact, maybe it's a story of somebody that came through, maybe it's something completely else. Chris, how about you?
One of the things that always was important to me in the museum is the touchable moon rock Farouk was the one who managed to get NASA to finally agree that we could have a rock that the public could touch. It was the first in the world. Now there's a few other places that you can touch a moon rock, but at that time, that was the very first. And Farouk had to work quite hard to get NASA to agree to it. And I remember one day a quite elderly woman walking up to it and touching it and just remarking on how much she had seen in her life. And now she was touching the moon. She was touching another world. And I just think those kinds of experiences that we can bring to folks are things that really that I remember a lot and that mean a lot.
Tom, how about you? Do you have a favorite memory?
When we were opening the building, my kids were fairly young. And so I remember my daughter, Abigail, for example, coming in and on the weekends, and we were hanging satellites in the satellite gallery and all that. That was fun. But not long after we opened, I forget which photographer took it. We, in the Satellites and Sounding Rockets gallery, we had an Aegina stage in one of the window wells, and it was kind of angled up in the window well. And one of the photographers took a picture. On the end, there was a plexiglass cone covering the bell. And the picture was of a kid at the end of the thing with his face pressed up, looking up into the engine. And I still have that photograph. And at the time, I thought, well, this is one of the reasons we did all of this stuff. People really are going to be moved and impressed and inspired by what they see in here.
And being able to take my own kids into the museum and see the looks on their faces. And I've got a great picture of both of them with you, Tom. We saw Tom out at a Mount Vernon festival, and right. Tom was launching some vintage hot air balloons, and we got a picture of Tom. But those kind of experiences that happen in the Air and Space Museum every single day are what make it such a magical place.
It's true.
Bob, how about you? Do you have a favorite memory?
I have so many. It's really hard to nail down any one of them. All I could say, I mean, I've met just about every prominent person in aviation and space in the 40 plus years I've been here. And it's astounding. The one that really just floored me, I'm sitting in my office one day and there's a knock on the door and Kathy Lewis is there. And she's escorting this lovely lady. And she goes, Bob, yeah. So I'd like to introduce you to somebody. I look up and I'm like, it was Valentina Tereshkova. She was just taking her, the first woman in space. We're just in the building, and we're just taking her around. That's the really fun thing about air and space. It is the destination for just about anybody who's been in aviation or space. They want to come here no matter where they're from. As I said, I don't know how many cosmonauts I've met, and I'm not in the space history department. I walked on the elevator, ran into Neil Armstrong, like, hey, how you doing? It's stuff like that. World War II aces, show my age, World War I pilots, 20s and 30s pilots. The look on kids' faces when they walk in the building, it's just astounding. The jaws drop.
Bob just hit the nail on the head. I remember before we opened, Wernher von Braun, NASA had already, as it were, kicked him upstairs. He had left Huntsville and he was working. NASA in those days was across the street. He would say, Tom, Wernher von Braun's downstairs and he wants to see the Robert Goddard stuff. Just show it to him, will you? And it was moments like that.
And I think the reaction is very similar from somebody that's walking through the doors the first time, the 40th time, or somebody that flew one of the aircraft that's hanging in the rafters. They get that look of awe when they walk in the door. And that, to me, that never gets old.
I think part of the magic of NASA, and you can see it downstairs, not all that many people have flown airplanes after all, but you'll go downstairs and you will see a father, a grandfather, a mother with their kids pointing at the X-1 or this aircraft or that aircraft, and telling their kid their own memories about when that event happened, the event represented by that machine. And again, it's, I think, part of the magic of the building and part of the reason that so many people have come and will continue to come as we reopen.
Thank you so much for joining us today and for your contributions to the museum.
If you don't know, there are big changes going on at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. The entire building is going to be transformed over the next several years.
Let's hear a little bit more about those big changes.
Welcome to the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum on the occasion of its 45th birthday. My name is Chris Brown, and I presently serve as the acting director of the museum. And it's a real privilege and pleasure to be able to celebrate this really momentous occasion. We are rebuilding, reimagining the entire museum on the mall. So after it has served over 350 million visitors in the course of its last 45 years, it's pretty worn out. And so we're using the occasion to rebuild the building, bring it up to modern standards, but most importantly, the 23 galleries within are all going to be transformed. Many of the same artifacts and objects that you're used to seeing will come back into the museum, but fully a third of the artifacts will be new and not seen before in the Mall Museum. So the museum's going to have a very new look and feel to it, very contemporary and very engaging, and that's really much of our intent. We want to be sure that every visitor that comes through our doors is able to see him or herself in the stories being told and in the collection. When you leave, we want that person, we want you to be as inspired as everyone else has been over the course of time coming to witness this collection in person. We want our visitors, whomever they are, wherever they come from, to see themselves in these stories and to be inspired and to see the opportunities that are available to them. Aviation and aerospace, while not uniquely American, is certainly part of the American experience and will be one of the defining moments of the, I would say, the last 100 years. And so it's really important. It's really important to us to make sure that this story, that what it inspires and the visions that can come from it resonate with everybody. And so on the occasion of our 45th birthday, happy birthday, but the big birthday is yet to come. We hope you'll join us for our 50th birthday in 2026 when we reopen the entire museum and are able to celebrate 50 years of incredible storytelling here in America's favorite museum.
The museum opened with a signal from a spacecraft and continues today with some amazing digital programming.
STEM in 30 is an Emmy-nominated TV show for middle school students, produced by the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum.
New episodes are released every month during the school year and cover topics ranging from the International Space Station to the Wright brothers.
Each episode is followed by an Air and Space live chat. These chats allow students to ask questions to experts.
Past experts have included Apollo 13's Jim Lovell and members of the United States Navy's Blue Angels.
The My Path series is produced by STEM in 30 and features prominent individuals from differing fields, including astronauts, engineers, mathematicians, and authors, telling how they got to where they are.
These short videos are a great way to introduce students to different careers and the winding road it takes to get there.
Smithsonian Science Starters is a video series that has science experts doing classroom-friendly, hands-on demos and connecting it to the real-world work they do.
Each video is accompanied by a lesson plan that allows teachers to replicate the demo or extend it in their classroom.
Did you know we have a podcast called Airspace?
The National Air and Space Museum contains the largest and most significant collection of air and spacecraft in the world. Behind those amazing machines are thousands of stories of human achievement, failure, and perseverance.
Join Emily, Matt, and Nick as they demystify one of the world's most visited museums and explore why people are so fascinated with stories of exploration, innovation, and discovery. Listen to Airspace wherever you find podcasts.
Flights of Fancy Storytime Online offers stories for young children and their families inspired by our collection of air and space objects and historic photos.
Educators Ann Kaspari and Diane Kidd will tell stories, do sketches, and demonstrate crafts that you can enjoy together at home.
Soar Together at Air and Space invites families to discover, together, the inspiring stories of innovators and explorers of aviation and space.
One weekend a month, families connect to the museum's collection and research through activities such as hands-on demonstrations, scavenger hunts, and live and virtual presentations and discussions.
The museum has inspired many people to pursue careers in aviation and space.
One of those people is naval aviator Ray Gator Stromberger.
Hi, I'm Commander Ray Stromberger. I'm the navigator of the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower. It was a big deal for me to bring my son to the museum because I went to DC as a kid. I believe the first time I went there I was in about 6th grade, just on a family trip, and we went to the Air and Space Museum. And there's all the things that I had seen on movies, built models of, and the real. The great impression that I came away from that experience with was obviously, airplanes and rockets are incredibly cool and amazing, but, Superman didn't build them and Superman didn't fly in them. Real people built and flew in them. They are real physical objects that, very smart and talented, but really pretty normal people worked really hard and put together and flew. You really walk away with the impression that if they can do it, then I can do something like that. I want him to see that, rockets and airplanes are awesome, but you can figure that out from YouTube, right? I want him to see the actual physical articles. I want him to know that rockets and airplanes aren't flown by Superman. They're not built by Einstein. They are real things in the real world that are made by real people. They're talented, hardworking people, but nonetheless, otherwise normal people, and that is something that he can aspire to.
By the time the museum turns 50, all of the new galleries will be opened.
We can't wait for you to visit the museum in downtown Washington, D.C., the Stephen F. Lee Barhazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia, or joining us for some of our online programming.
Happy birthday to the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum.
We highly encourage everyone watching to have a piece of cake today to celebrate.
Thanks for watching.